Mike, Mike was a very calm-natured fellow, and about 3 hours later, somewhere in the afternoon of the 4th of April, 1968, my head was laying on his lap. He was sitting under the same bush he'd put me under, and I looked up at him, and he says, "It's just me and you, Ben." I looked at his face. It was all blistered from where he had come into the fire to pull me out. His hands were blistered. I didn't know it at the time, but I had my left ankle was crushed and shot. I knew that I had the burns that I could see. I thought were open scrapes, but I knew that I had open wounds of some sort.
Ben Khe survived a missile strike, a burning helicopter crash, and 4 days trapped behind enemy lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then fought the army to let him keep flying. And I mean, when you hear what this man went through, you'll understand why he wasn't about to let anyone tell him his career was over. Khe was a medevac pilot with the 101st Airborne Division's supporting air ambulance unit in Vietnam, flying dust-off missions into some of the most dangerous terrain in the entire war. His story is one of those accounts that has everything, combat, survival, brotherhood, and a quiet act of kindness at the end that changed the whole trajectory of his life. We're talking about a pilot who got shot down by a B-40 rocket, pulled from a burning aircraft by his co-pilot, spent days evading the enemy with a crushed ankle and burns all over his body, and then convinced a brigadier general to let him stay in uniform when everyone said he was finished. And look, before we get too far into Ben Khe story, I want to mention that I put these veteran accounts out pretty regularly because I think they matter. These men lived through things that most of us can't even imagine, and their voices deserve to be heard. So if you're the type of person who cares about preserving this kind of history, maybe consider subscribing so you don't miss these stories when they come out. All right, back to Khe. Ben Khe flew medevac helicopters in Vietnam, which was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. Dust-off pilots, they called them, named after the radio call sign, and these guys flew into active firefights to pull out wounded soldiers. No weapons on the aircraft except maybe a pistol on your hip. The Geneva Convention said medical aircraft shouldn't be armed, so dust-off crews went in relying on speed, skill, and a big red cross painted on the side of their helicopter. The enemy didn't always respect that red cross, but the pilots flew anyway. A typical air ambulance unit would have about 6 aircraft in a detachment, maybe 65 to 70 people, and a full company would be 25 aircraft. Khe explains that you didn't always fly with the same crew every day. You might be paired with a different co-pilot and different crew depending on the assignment. But when you got field-sighted, which means your aircraft was sent to cover a particular area for a week or so, then you stayed together as a constant team. And that's how it was when Ben Khe was assigned to support the 22nd Surgical Hospital. Khe had a co-pilot named Charles Meyer, a big West Virginia boy, about 6 feet tall, who had been in country longer than Khe. Meyer was technically the aircraft commander because of his time in Vietnam, but the two of them flew as a team much of the time. That partnership, that bond between Khe and Meyer, would turn out to be the most important relationship of Ben Khe's entire tour in Vietnam, because Charles Meyer would end up saving Khe's life, pulling him from a crashed and burning helicopter with his bare hands. But we'll get to that. The mission that changed everything happened on April 4th, 1968. Ben Khe's crew had been supporting the 22nd Surgical Hospital for about 2 weeks at that point, flying medevac missions out of their assigned area. That night, around midnight, they got a call. A unit from the 101st Airborne, the 2nd of the 502nd Infantry, was in contact with the enemy out in the Ah Shaw Valley. The Ah Shaw Valley was one of the most dangerous places in all of Vietnam. It sat right up against the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that network of roads and paths that ran north to south through Laos and Cambodia, carrying supplies and troops from North Vietnam into the south. The valley itself was thick with triple canopy jungle, the kind of terrain where sunlight barely reached the ground and a helicopter couldn't land even if you wanted to. Operations in the Ah Shaw were always treacherous. Knisley and his crew cranked up their helicopter and flew out to the area. It was a night mission, and as they approached, it became obvious this was going to be a hoist extraction. No landing zone, just lowering a jungle penetrator through the trees to pull wounded men up one at a time. A hoist mission at night, Knisley says, is just the hairiest of all. You're hovering in the dark, completely vulnerable, while your crew chief lowers a cable down through trees you can barely see. As they got close to the general area, the Italian commander of the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry, called them on the radio. "Dust off, this is not going to work," he told them. "They're still in contact. You guys stand by, we'll call you when we can get you in." So, Knisley's crew flew back to Phu Bai airfield and refueled. They waited through the rest of the night. About sunup, they got another call. "Wait another hour, then come back out." So they did. They flew back to the area in the daylight, which was better than working in the dark, but still incredibly dangerous. The jungle below was triple canopy, dense vegetation that went up maybe 100 feet or more. Gunship support wasn't available, so they were going in without armed escort. Ben Knisley and his crew began hovering around, looking for the smoke grenade that the ground troops would pop to mark their position. The smoke would filter up through the trees, giving the helicopter crew a visual reference for where to lower the hoist. They circled, searching. And then the crew chief came over the intercom. "Hey, sir, I got yellow smoke over here at 3 o'clock. At that exact moment, the cockpit went bright white. Ben Knisley remembers thinking it was like a nuclear explosion. Everything just went perfectly white. They'd been hit by a B-40 rocket. The B-40 was a Soviet-designed rocket-propelled grenade used extensively by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. The missile hit Knisley's helicopter in the left rear, severing the tail boom completely. Without a tail boom, a helicopter can't maintain directional control. The torque from the main rotor starts spinning the entire aircraft like a top. That's exactly what happened. One of the pilots, Knisley isn't sure if it was him or Meyer, pulled power out of pure instinct. Something bad is happening, reduce power. And somehow, the helicopter flew, spinning like a top, for almost a quarter of a mile from where they'd been hit. Then it crashed down into the valley, even closer to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, deeper into enemy territory. Ben Knisley was unconscious from the moment he saw that white flash in the cockpit. He doesn't remember the crash itself, but his co-pilot, Charles Meyer, was conscious. Meyer climbed out of the wreckage after they went down through the trees. He saw the helicopter burning. He went back and found Knisley still sitting in the pilot's seat. The aircraft was on fire. Meyer kicked in the glass with his feet to get access to the cockpit. He actually patted out a fire that was burning on Knisley's clothes. Then he unbuckled Knisley's harness, caught him as he fell forward, and pulled him out of the burning helicopter. Meyer carried or dragged Knisley over to a small bush and put him underneath it, out of immediate danger. Then Charles Meyer went back to see if he could get anyone else out, but the fire was too intense by that point. The crew chief, Sergeant James E. Richardson, was still in the aircraft. Richardson didn't make it out. He burned up in that helicopter. Ben Knisley has visited Richardson's name on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., many times over the years. James E. Richardson, a man who died in the same crash that Knisley survived only because Charles Meyer pulled him out in time. The medic on the crew, a specialist named Small, had actually been blown out of the aircraft when the rocket hit. He landed in a tree some distance away with a broken hip. The ground troops found him fairly quickly, up near where the soldiers they'd been trying to rescue were located. But at the crash site, it was just Knisley and Meyer. Meyer sat under that bush with Knisley's head in his lap, waiting. About 3 hours later, somewhere in the afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Ben Knisley woke up. He looked up at Meyer's face. It was blistered from the fire, burned from when Meyer had gone into the flames to pull Knisley out. Meyer's hands were blistered too, and Meyer looked down at Knisley and said simply, "It's just me and you, Ben." Knisley didn't know it yet, but his left ankle was crushed and shot. He could see burns on himself that he initially thought were open scrapes, but he knew he had serious wounds. He couldn't walk. Meyer could walk, despite his burns, so Meyer was ambulatory, even though his face and hands were badly blistered. The aircraft was smoldering nearby. They decided to stay right where they were, hoping someone would come find them. If you're still with me and this story is hitting you like it's hitting me, I just want to say thanks for listening. Stories like Ben Knisley's deserve to be remembered. They really do. And if you're finding value in these accounts, maybe hit that subscribe button so we can keep putting these veteran voices out there. This kind of history shouldn't be forgotten. All right, continuing with what happened to Knisley and Meyer after the crash. That first evening passed without rescue. No sleep, of course, no food, no water. Ben Knisley had a .38 caliber pistol on his hip, and that was it. They were deep in enemy territory, right on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they could hear trucks and vehicles moving around them all night. Those were enemy vehicles, North Vietnamese supply convoys using the trail system. Knisley and Meyer made a pact. They wouldn't identify themselves if someone called out in the distance, not until they could actually see that the people were Americans. It would be too easy for the enemy to call out in English, trying to get survivors to reveal their position. So they would wait to see people before letting anyone know where they were. They stayed low, kept a low profile, essentially doing escape and evasion under bushes, hiding from the enemy forces all around them. Maybe the second night, Knisley heard noise, bushes moving close by. Wild hogs, it turned out, but Knisley didn't know that at the time. He actually drew his pistol, thinking, "This is it, we're about to be captured." He was terrified. But Meyer recognized the sounds. "Those are pigs," he told Knisley. "Wild pigs." And the animals moved on. At some point, probably the second or third day, Knisley and Meyer decided they should try to move up the hill. Maybe someone would find them at the top. Knisley could crawl even with his destroyed ankle. Meyer could walk. So they started making their way uphill. They got about halfway up and looked at each other. This is pretty dumb, they realized. The rescuers are going to go to the aircraft wreckage. They're not going to search random hilltops. So they turned around and crawled back down the hill. But here's the thing. They never found the wreckage again. They got back to the general area, but Knisley was pretty delirious by this point. The pain, the dehydration, the shock, all of it was taking a toll. Ben Knisley made a suggestion to Meyer. "Mike, why don't you go on?" he said. "I'll stay here. You bring somebody back." Knisley knew he couldn't cover the terrain. His ankle was destroyed. He was slowing Meyer down. If Meyer went alone, he might actually make it to friendly forces and bring back help. But Charles Meyer, bless his heart as Knisley puts it, said no. "No, we're a team. I'm with you. We're going to stay together." That's the kind of bond that combat creates. Meyer wouldn't leave his pilot behind, even though leaving might have been the smart tactical decision. They were a team, and Meyer was going to stay with Knisley no matter what happened. What Knisley and Meyer didn't know was that a special rescue team had been organized to find them. The day they crashed, there was an immediate request up the chain of command to send people in to look for survivors. But it was a hot area, enemy everywhere, and General Barsanti, the commanding general of the 101st Airborne at the time, said no, we can't afford to send anybody in there yet. It was too dangerous. The risk of losing more men was too high. But a lieutenant from the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry, a man named Tim Lickness, said to his captain, "Let me take a team and go see. I know basically where they are." And command approved it. Tim Lickness put together a 5-man team, 4 infantrymen, shooters, and 1 medic. They went out looking for the downed medevac crew. Lickness's team actually had a firefight with enemy troops while trying to reach Knisley and Meyer. They were pushing through hostile territory, engaging the enemy, just to reach 2 wounded pilots hiding under bushes somewhere in the jungle. Finally, off in the distance, Knisley and Meyer heard a yell. "Hey, dust off! Hey, dust off!" They had already decided they wouldn't react to calls like that. Too dangerous. Might be the enemy trying to draw them out. But at that point, both of them were so exhausted, so desperate, that they raised their arms and yelled back, "We're over here! We're over here!" And then they looked at each other thinking, "Oh God, did we do it right? What if that wasn't Americans?" But it was. It was Lickness's rescue team. They'd found the survivors. When the rescue team reached them, the medic had a can of sea-ration apricots in his backpack. Ben Knisley doesn't even like apricots, but he hadn't had anything to eat or drink in days. That can of apricots was one of the most memorable moments of the whole experience. The medic also gave Knisley his helmet, because there were mortars and gunfire happening all around them even then. It was a kind gesture that Knisley remembers to this day. The rescue team had to bring Knisley and Meyer back over the ridge, back to where the remnants of their small infantry company were positioned on a hilltop. Knisley estimates there were maybe 50 soldiers there. They spent that night with the infantry unit, still not extracted, still in danger. Meanwhile, back in the States, Ben Knisley's wife and family and parents had all received telegrams. 24 hours after the crash, with no word on survivors, Knisley had been declared missing in action. Those MIA telegrams are brutal. Sorry to report that the following individual is missing in action. The families were left not knowing if their son, their husband, was alive or dead. Even the next day, they still couldn't get helicopters in to extract the survivors. The jungle was too thick, and the enemy presence was too heavy. Finally, they used C4 explosive compound to blow down trees, creating a gap where a helicopter could hover but still not land. It would be another hoist mission, lifting people out one at a time on a cable. On the day they were finally lifted out, 16 people were extracted from that hilltop. Ben Knisley's company commander, who had been 100 miles away at their home unit, actually flew in to be part of the rescue effort. That's the kind of thing that happens in the military. Your people will move heaven and earth to bring you home. Knisley doesn't remember which lift he went out on. He might have been first, he's not sure. They loaded 3 or 4 people at a time onto the hoist, pulled them up into the helicopter, and flew them out. Knisley knew they were going to the 22nd Surgical Hospital, the same unit he'd been working with as their medevac support. The 22nd had been advised that a lot of casualties were coming in, and, oh, by the way, we found your medevac crew and they're part of what's coming. The 22nd Surgical knew Knisley and Meyer were coming, and a number of people from the unit met the helicopter at the pad when it landed. From that point, Ben Knisley's memory gets shaky and foggy. He was in bad shape. Very dry, very emaciated, completely dehydrated after days without water. Someone at the 22nd told him, "Another day without fluids and you'd be on a different table than ours," meaning the morgue table instead of the operating table. Once they got fluids started, Knisley immediately fell asleep. The next day, his home unit requested that both Knisley and Meyer be transferred back closer to Queen Yon, where the air ambulance company was based. So Knisley flew to Queen Yon and was admitted to the 85th Evacuation Hospital. The triage at that point was basically just cast the leg, because they couldn't do much with it there. They weren't even sure they were going to save the leg. Meanwhile, they began treating his burns. After a day or two in Queen Yon, Knisley was flown to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the staging point for medical evacuations out of the combat zone. He spent maybe one night at Clark, then was put on a burn flight to Japan, to the 106th General Hospital. He went to the burn unit there and stayed maybe a week or 10 days. Charles Meyer actually came with him, first to the 106th in Japan, and then on the flight back to the United States. Meyer's burns were healing, but since they were manifested together, he came along. Both men ended up at Brooke Army Medical Center at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Brooke Army had one of the premier burn units in the military medical system. This is where Ben Knisley would spend the next 9 months recovering. His leg required extensive work. His burns required skin grafts. The recovery was long and painful and uncertain. And then something happened that could have ended Ben Knisley's military career right there. One morning, a young Army clerk arrived at Knisley's bedside with a briefcase in his hand. He introduced himself and said, "I'm here to survey you out of the Army." Knisley's response was immediate. "No, no, no, you don't understand. I don't want to get out of the Army." The clerk looked at him sympathetically. "Oh, sir," he said, "I don't think you're going to be able to stay. It's my orders here." He showed Knisley some paperwork. "We're going to process you out." But Ben Knisley wasn't having it. "You go find somebody with more rank than you," he told the clerk. "I'm not getting out of the Army." Knisley took his case all the way up to a brigadier general named Hamrick. He sat in front of the general and made his argument. "Sir, I don't want to get out. I've got no place else to be." The general pointed out the obvious. "You're going to have a profile. You're going to have some restrictions." Knisley didn't care. "It's okay," he said. "I want to stay." And then he added something that really made the general's eyebrows go up. "And by the way, I want to fly helicopters too." "Oh no," the general said. "That's not going to happen." But they processed the paperwork to let Knisley stay in the Army. And Ben Knisley, even as he was going through recovery, through therapy for his leg, through skin graft surgeries, through months on the burn ward, he kept pushing to get back on flight status. Everyone told him it was impossible. "You're pretty far-fetched," they said. "That's not going to happen." But Knisley asked the question that would define his approach. "What do I have to do?" They outlined the procedures, the tests, the requirements. Knisley studied like he was back in flight school. He learned everything, had it all down pat. But there was one problem he knew about that he didn't tell anyone. In a Huey helicopter, there's a maneuver called hydraulics off. You disable the hydraulic assists to the controls and fly the aircraft manually. It's an emergency procedure that every pilot has to be able to perform. The problem was that during the hydraulics off maneuver, you need strong left pedal input to counteract the torque of the rotor. And Ben Knisley didn't have strength in his left leg anymore. His ankle had been crushed. He couldn't push the left pedal hard enough to complete that maneuver. He knew it, but he figured, maybe they won't ask me to do that maneuver. Maybe I'll get lucky. The day came for his test flight. He was assigned an instructor pilot named Captain Ed Preston at Fort Sam Houston. A flight surgeon, a lieutenant colonel whose name Knisley doesn't remember, was also present to evaluate him. Everyone had warned Knisley, "Oh God, you're in trouble. Ed Preston is a hard ass. He's not going to cut you any slack." Knisley didn't know Preston very well, so he had no idea what to expect. They went out, pre-flighted the aircraft, took off. They stayed in the pattern, did some normal approaches and takeoffs. Knisley handled everything fine from the pilot's seat. And then Ed Preston said the words Knisley had been dreading. "Let's go over to Martindale Airfield and do a hydraulics off." Knisley's heart sank. But what could he say? They flew over to Martindale, and Knisley lined up for the maneuver. A hydraulics off landing is basically sliding the helicopter in on its skids because you can't hover without hydraulic assists. It's a running landing, like an airplane. You skid it in, but as you reduce power, the torque from the rotor causes the nose to turn to the right, more to the right, more to the right. And if you can't push in adequate left pedal to bring the nose back around, you can't complete the maneuver safely. Knisley began the approach. The nose started turning right. He pushed the left pedal as hard as he could. It wasn't enough. More to the right. He pushed harder, still not enough. He was just about to say the words that would end his flying career. "Sir, you have the aircraft." He was about to give up the controls, admit he couldn't do it. And at that exact moment, Ben Knisley felt the nose begin to move just a little bit to the left. He felt the pedal move slightly. He wasn't doing it. He couldn't push any harder. Someone else had pushed that pedal for him. Knisley kept the controls. He flew the aircraft down to the ground and skidded it in, completing the maneuver. When they came to a stop, Knisley looked over at Ed Preston, expecting him to say, "Had to help you there, didn't I, Lieutenant?" But Preston didn't say a word about it. He just said, "Okay, put the hydraulics back on. Let's go back to the heliport." Knisley flew back, completely unsure what was going to happen. He knew he had failed that maneuver. Preston had helped him. There was no way Preston didn't know that Knisley couldn't complete it on his own. They landed, and Preston told the flight surgeon, "Doc and I will be upstairs in ops. You shut her down, come on up." The crew chief, who was with the aircraft, could sense Knisley's fear. Knisley might even have been crying, he's not sure. He shut down the aircraft and walked upstairs to face what he assumed would be the end of his flying career. And Ed Preston shook his hand. "You're returned to flight status," Preston said, "but you have to fly dual pilot for 2 years." He knew. Ed Preston knew that Knisley had needed help on that pedal. He knew that Knisley's leg wasn't strong enough, and he chose to pass him anyway. He chose to give a wounded pilot a chance. As Ben Knisley puts it, "Here's a case where a guy that I didn't know at all took a chance on me. As a result, I stayed in the Army. I flew helicopters. I did a 28-year career. I flew probably 2,000 or 3,000 hours of flight time since that moment. And Ed Preston didn't have to do that. What a nice gesture. He changed my life." We're getting close to the end of Ben Knisley's story now, and I want to pause for a moment. If you've stayed with this all the way through, thank you. These stories take time to tell properly, and the fact that you're listening means you understand why it matters. If you want to help veteran voices like Ben Knisley's reach more people, subscribing and sharing really does make a difference. This is the kind of history that deserves to be preserved, passed on, remembered. All right, bringing Ben Knisley's story to a close. What do you take away from an experience like this? A missile strike, a burning helicopter, 4 days evading the enemy with a crushed ankle, months of recovery, and then one moment in a test flight where everything hung in the balance. Ben Knisley has had decades to think about it all, and the things he emphasizes are interesting. He talks about the men who saved him. Charles Meyer, the big West Virginia kid who pulled him out of a burning aircraft and refused to leave him behind in the jungle. Tim Lickness, the infantry lieutenant who volunteered to lead a rescue team into enemy territory. Ed Preston, the instructor pilot who gave a wounded man a second chance when he didn't have to. These are the moments that stand out for Knisley. Not the horror of the crash, not the fear of those days hiding from the enemy, but the human connections, the acts of courage and kindness that made the difference between life and death, between a career ended and a career continued. Sergeant James Richardson, the crew chief who didn't make it out of that burning helicopter, his name is on the wall in Washington. Knisley has visited it many times. That weight, the weight of surviving when someone else didn't, that never goes away. Richardson should have lived too. He was just in the wrong spot when the fire got too intense. That's how it works in combat sometimes. Inches and seconds make the difference between who comes home and who doesn't. Ben Knisley came home. He healed, as much as anyone heals from something like that. He fought to stay in uniform when the Army wanted to discharge him. He fought to return to flight status when everyone said it was impossible. And when he needed just a little bit of help to complete one maneuver, a man named Ed Preston decided that a wounded warrior who wanted it that badly deserved a chance. 28 years in the Army, thousands of hours of flight time after that test at Martindale Airfield. A full career that almost ended on a hospital bed in San Antonio when a clerk showed up with discharge papers. None of that happens without Charles Meyer pulling Knisley from the flames. None of it happens without Tim Lickness's rescue team fighting their way through enemy territory. None of it happens without Ed Preston's quiet act of grace on that hydraulics off maneuver. That's what Ben Knisley's story teaches us, I think. It's not just about one man's survival. It's about all the people around him who made that survival possible, who made everything that came after possible. The co-pilot who wouldn't leave his teammate behind, the infantry lieutenant who volunteered for a dangerous rescue, the instructor pilot who chose compassion over regulations. These choices matter. They ripple forward through decades, through entire lives. Ben Knisley served 28 years in the Army because people chose to help him when they didn't have to. Ed Preston passed away eventually, like we all do. But before he died, Ben Knisley got to share this story with Preston's son. That's how these things get passed on. The son knows now what his father did, knows that one moment of kindness in a test flight changed another man's entire life. That's worth something. That's worth remembering. April 4th, 1968. A B-40 rocket. A burning helicopter in the A Shau Valley. 4 days of survival. 9 months of recovery. One test flight that could have gone either way, and a 28-year career that almost never happened. That's Ben Knisley's story, and it's one hell of a story. This was the account of Ben Knisley, a medevac pilot who needed his own rescue in Vietnam, and then spent the rest of his career proving that the people who believed in him were right to do so. Thanks for listening.